2024 might be the most dangerous year since 1939. Welcome to Geopolitics Demystified, where we bring in perspectives you do not see or hear in the mainstream media. I'm your host, S.L. Kanthan. There was an assassination attempt aimed at Slovakia's prime minister a few weeks ago. Then, Iran's president died in a helicopter crash, which came just a few weeks after Iran had launched a massive drone missile attack on Israel. This comes in the midst of simultaneous Israeli-American wars against Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Assad in Syria, and Houthis in Yemen, all of which have the potential to explode into a terrifying regional war. By the way, the war against Gaza is really a combination of genocide and brutal ethnic cleansing. Of course, let's not forget Ukraine, whose fight for survival is, according to the Pentagon chief, a matter of European security and American security. All the while, the U.S. is preparing for a decisive war against China by building new military bases in the Philippines, changing the Japanese constitution to authorize wars, and fueling Taiwanese independence. The powder kegs in the Middle East and Ukraine may seem contained, but are just one serious attack away from blowing up. Imagine a U.S. aircraft carrier in the Red Sea being damaged or sunk by the Houthis' anti-ship ballistic missiles and drones, Tel Aviv being hit by Hezbollah's missiles, or Ukraine bombing Moscow with long-range missiles provided by the U.S. or the EU. A terrifying simulation at Princeton University shows that a single tactical nuclear warning shot by Russia or NATO, on purpose or by mistake, can lead to 35 million deaths within 5 hours in Europe and Russia. Existential crisis everywhere. While the Middle East has a relatively decent chance for controlled chaos, the Ukraine situation has turned into an existential crisis for all the parties involved: Russia, NATO, and the US. Regarding Gaza, one possibility is that Israel completely pushes out Palestinians from Gaza and then settles for a Cold War or a long, low-intensity war with Hezbollah and Houthis. As long as Israel and the U.S. stay away from Iran, a tense peace is possible. However, regarding Ukraine, no such solution is possible. In the current state, Russia is winning, albeit slowly. Russia has already captured 4 major regions in Ukraine and has not only solidified the gains, but is also advancing steadily, as seen in the picture of strategic cities like Bakhmut or the recent advances towards Kharkov, the second largest Ukrainian city. In the best-case scenario for Russia, it would advance all the way up to Odessa, turning Ukraine into a landlocked country. That will ring the death knell for Ukraine as a country. Note that Russia cannot afford to lose. It will be the end of Russia, which will then be chopped up and erased from history. After all, Americans, Wall Street, and the Harvard boys attempted to do just that in the 1990s when they imposed shock therapy. Russia's GDP fell 40% in just a few years. Inflation soared up to 2,500%. Poverty and suicide soared, and the nation was imploding. Only Putin was able to save Russia. More importantly, China will not allow Russia to fail because of strategic, economic, and national security reasons. If Putin is replaced by a pro-US puppet, China will have a hostile neighbor on its 4,200-kilometer border, and thousands of Russian nuclear missiles will be suddenly pointing at Beijing and Shanghai instead of New York and Washington. Thus, the Ukraine war is a matter of existential crisis for China as well. Xi Jinping and Putin, who have met 40 times, have been working on a vision of a multipolar world for a decade now. The two great friends with no limits partnership have understood the fundamental dynamics of the changing world. Xi Jinping has repeatedly said that great changes unseen in a century are happening, and Putin has said openly that the era of Western domination is over. Not surprisingly, China has ensured Russia's survival over the last 2 years. Thanks to China, the Russian military-industrial complex and the civilian sectors are thriving despite the thousands of US-EU sanctions. 90% of Russia-China trade is now happening in local currencies, that is, ruble and yuan. And the yuan has become the number one currency in Russia's foreign exchange reserves. As for Ukraine, it is running out of soldiers, weapons, ammunition, and morale. Every day on social media, there are videos of Ukrainian men being violently abducted by the military and sent to the front lines. What chance do these untrained civilians have against Russian artillery, drones, and missiles? The deindustrialized USA and Europe are unable to produce enough artillery shells, let alone tanks and missile defense systems. If Ukraine surrenders or even agrees to freeze the conflict, it will be an irrecoverable blow to the prestige of the US and NATO. Many Western leaders, from Biden to von der Leyen and Sunak to Baerbock, will become pariahs in their own countries. That Russia not only survived, but got to keep Crimea and 20% of Ukraine will be viewed as a geopolitically fatal blow to the mighty American empire and NATO. It will be 100 times worse than America's defeat in the Vietnam War. After such a loss, no country will join the US in its crusade against China, America's biggest geopolitical rival. In summary, everyone in this conflict is determined to win, and there are no politically viable compromises. Bitter truth for Germans and Europeans. If Europeans are naive enough to think the US exists to protect them, they will find out quickly that they will be sacrificed one more time. Watch how Ukraine is being used as a cannon fodder for the globalists who gleefully proclaim Ukrainians will fight Russia to the last man. This is the best investment for America. Guess what? The same logic applies to Europe, who are also sacrificial pawns and not allies. One of the greatest modern philosophers, Immanuel Kant, was a big fan of truth, however inconvenient they might be. He said, "If truth shall kill them, let them die." So let's talk some blunt truth, although it may hurt some feelings, especially the soft and politically correct ones of modern times. The anti-Russia hatred of the transatlantic cabal is deep and has a long history going back to the 19th century. The same cabal also really detested Germany. Just read the Morgenthau Plan and the book called Germany Must Perish. These were not mere fantasies. What happened to Germans between World War I and some years after World War II should leave no doubt. Also, during the Cold War, the US made numerous plans from the late 1940s until the early 1960s to drop highly powerful atomic and hydrogen bombs on 1,200 cities in Russia, Eastern Europe, and China. This would have killed 600 million people in the USSR and China. Of course, the resulting radiation fallout and the nuclear winter would have wiped off at least 100 million more civilians in Western Europe as well. Think about that for a minute. If destroying Europe and Russia could prolong the American primacy, the plan will be swiftly approved in Washington, D.C. today. As one more reminder to American ruthlessness, here's what Truman said during World War II. If we see that Germany is winning, we ought to help Russia. If Russia is winning, we ought to help Germany. In that way, we let them kill as many as possible. How many Germans know about the biggest theft of intellectual property after World War II? The US and the USSR, to a smaller extent, stole invaluable technologies from innovations from Germany. Everything from cars and refrigerators to missiles and rockets. Semiconductor technology, arguably the most important innovation of the 20th century, was actually stolen from Germany and turned into an American invention, for which Americans received the Nobel Prize. The true father of transistors is Heinrich Welcker, who was interrogated by American experts after World War II and was forced to hand over all his work. All the German inventors were forced to sign agreements never to claim or even talk about their hijacked work. Nearly 800,000 German patents and designs were stolen by the Allies. Not to mention the 1,600 German scientists who were kidnapped and moved to the US under the CIA's Operation Paperclip. Fast forward to the recent past, the American war on Europe has not ended. Sometimes the war is cultural, though many forms of social engineering. The wars in the Middle East over the last 2 decades not only tried to establish the United States of Israel as a regional hegemon, but also provided the perfect excuse to send tens of millions of refugees and migrants into Europe. The goal is to create a homogeneous Europe where every country from France and Germany to Italy and Spain look alike in demographics, because this will make it easier for the EU and the globalists to rule Europe. If the real concern is a decline in European population, the rational solution would be to encourage traditional values and nuclear families. Instead, look what is happening. The elites are spreading degeneracy and satanic psychological operations that prey on children. Looking at the big picture, there is a powerful geopolitical imperative for the US to fuel all this chaos. America needs a great reset. Here is the simple reason why the US cannot afford to settle for peace with Russia, Iran, and China. The American century is coming to an end, and the only way to prolong it is by a great reset. The US is drowning in debt, which is growing by $1 trillion every 100 days. The deindustrialized and financialized American economy is no longer competitive. China has surpassed the US in a myriad of key technologies, and the highly polarized American society is on the verge of another civil war. Think about World War II, which lifted the US out of the Great Depression, destroyed the European powers, elevated the US dollar as the global reserve currency, and created the American empire. Only a repeat of such a situation would make America great again. In the ideal situation, a great war would help the US wipe off its debt and start all over again. And if Europe and China were destroyed, the smartest people and the best companies there would emigrate to the US and jumpstart the American economy. And a conquered Russia would provide tens of trillions of dollars of natural resources for BlackRock and other Wall Street firms to exploit. There's also another colossal reason why the globalists are afraid of a multipolar world. That is, history being rewritten. Everything that we think we know about the past are actually manipulated by the Anglo-American Empire. They control all the mainstream narratives throughout the world thanks to their monopolistic control over news, books, academia, think tanks, websites, apps, TV, movies, social media, and so on. And they have even passed some laws to protect their biggest lies and are trying to pass more Orwellian laws. In a world where America is no longer number one, entire world history will be rewritten, especially the Western history over the last 300 years. And many heroes of today will be turned into villains and vice versa. This scenario is probably more dreadful for the globalists than simply losing financial and military power. American empire in its last stage. Ray Dalio is the founder of one of the largest hedge funds in the world. In his book called Changing World Order, he analyzes the rise and fall of global empires over the last 500 years. These empires include the Portuguese, Spanish, Dutch, French, British, and American. In his archetypical big cycle, all empires follow the same path. First, rise of the empire. This is where you see strong leadership, inventive and competitive economy, strong culture, high income growth for everyone, robust financial markets, and low debt. The next stage is peak. This is where we see decreasing productivity, growing inequality, and the country losing its competitiveness. The last stage is decline, where the economy experiences large debts and the government prints money to hide the decline. There is a lot of internal conflict, and then eventually we see the loss of reserve currency status for the empire's currency. While Americans are putting on a brave face and pretending as if they are the king of the world, it is obvious where they are on Ray Dalio's chart, somewhere around stage 15. That's 15 out of 18. The next stage, number 16, will be the loss of reserve currency status. Stage 17 is weak leadership. Although it seems like we've already reached there in the US, and you would know that if you watched the Biden-Trump debate a few days ago. And the final stage of the empire is civil war and the end of the empire. It's no surprise or it's no coincidence that they have already released a movie about a civil war in the US. Currently, the next step, loss of reserve currency status, is already underway thanks to de-dollarization efforts happening all over the world. For example, already more than half of China's cross-border transactions are happening in yuan. And 90% of Russia-China trade is happening in rubles and yuan. If you go back just 14 years ago, the use of yuan was virtually zero. And now it's more than half of China's transactions with the rest of the world. The other global phenomenon is to decouple from the US dollar is about the BRICS expansion. Earlier this year, 5 countries, including Saudi Arabia, Iran, and the UAE, joined BRICS. BRICS, of course, refers to the 5 countries of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. This year, 30 more countries have applied for membership. This new coalition will not only try to do trade in local currencies as much as possible, but is also working on a BRICS currency or some sort of a blockchain based system which will be used just for trade. And this would not replace the sovereign currencies like the euro did. Another option to bypass the US dollar is the China developed system called the mBridge, which is based on distributed ledger technology and central bank digital currencies. mBridge transactions take just 7 seconds and cut cross-border payment costs by 50%. mBridge already has Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Thailand as participants. Interestingly, this also has the blessing of the Bank of International Settlement, which is the central bank of all central banks in the world. What is really interesting is that the US dollar's share of global reserve currency has already fallen from 72% to 58% over the last 2 decades. However, if you adjust for price changes, that is, the US bonds bought in the past have lost a lot of their values now because of the current higher yields. So once you take that into account, the dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves fell to 47% by early 2023. When this share falls another 10 percentage points, the world will acknowledge the death of King Dollar. The consequences of the dollar losing its primacy will bring about seismic changes in the American economy. The cost of imports and thus the cost of living will go up. Inflation will skyrocket as the rest of the world also demands much higher interest rates for U.S. treasuries, i.e. bonds. The U.S. government will be forced to cut spending, including shutting down overseas military bases. Numerous benefits such as Social Security and Medicare will be slashed, and retirement age will be raised. The lavish American lifestyle funded by debt will come to a screeching halt. The U.S. cannot afford any more very high trade deficit and very high fiscal budget deficit. This is the main reason the Federal Reserve Bank over the last 3 years has kept the interest rates high, which artificially boosts the demand for U.S. treasuries. However, for a country caught in debt trap, high interest rates are lethal. The US government, corporations, and households combined have $100 trillion of debt. Thus, if the interest rates go up, the payments on that debt will also skyrocket, and that will cripple the economy. The US dollar is facing a death by 1,000 cuts. Perhaps the demise will be accelerated by Saudi Arabia and OPEC selling oil and gas for yuan. This is the concept of petro-yuan, which is just like the petrodollar. And it is already a reality to some extent, since Russia, Iran, and a couple of other countries are selling oil, gas, and other commodities for yuan. How about the other crucial pillars of an empire? Military, technology, diplomacy, and soft power. The US military is totally corrupted by private contractors who bribe the politicians to get sweet deals. For example, the US military pays $10,000 for a toilet seat, and $90,000 for a small bag of plastic bushings. While Russia and China have mastered hypersonic missiles, the US is still struggling. And American Raytheon, the world's largest aerospace and defense company, depends on thousands of suppliers from China, America's biggest geopolitical rival. In technology, the US is falling behind China in many crucial areas, from electric vehicles and telecom to e-commerce and internet apps. Bide, Huawei, TikTok, DJI, Shine, etc., are crushing American competitors who then run to the US government for tariffs and trade barriers. Hard to believe that this is the USA which championed free trade and established organizations such as the WTO. The only reason that China has not surpassed the US in AI, which is artificial intelligence, and semiconductors, is the rigged mafia-like system by which the US is able to prevent Taiwan, Netherlands, Japan, and South Korea from selling high-end semiconductor goods and services to China. The US is quickly losing its soft power and diplomatic power. 44% of the people around the world view the US as a threat to peace and democracy. In all the UN votes regarding Gaza over the last few months, the US has always been on the side of a tiny minority. Sick of the US wielding its veto power in the UN Security Council, many countries are demanding a change to the UN. Misery for the average American. The United States of America is suffering from a myriad of systemic problems that have been ignored for decades. Some of these endemic crises are now hard to sweep under the rug, and other explosive and intractable issues are just around the corner. The appalling fact is that the disease has metastasized into many areas of the society. Politics, economy, infrastructure, healthcare, foreign policy, and even at an individual level. The income and wealth inequality in the US are stunning. 29% of Americans earn so little that they cannot even afford basic necessities. And another 40% barely survive from paycheck to paycheck. The top 10% of Americans own 75% of the household wealth. And they are the ones you see bragging about America's prosperity on social media. What about public goods such as infrastructure? Bridges, roads, dams, levees are all falling apart in the USA, the allegedly richest country on earth. There are 1,500 train accidents every year, and there are 45,000 structurally deficient bridges. Just imagine driving over them. Very scary. Every day, some disastrous accidents happens in the USA. Toxic chemical spills, warehouses and factories on fire, massive explosions, and so on. America is an aging, crumbling empire that's run by corrupt elites far removed from the ordinary people. But it's not just infrastructure. Entire cities and small towns are collapsing all over Middle America. Numerous cities like Detroit have lost 60% or more of their population in the last few decades, turning into ghost cities. And thousands of small towns across the US look just like they did back in the 1950s when America was quote unquote great. The inner cities all over the US are full of crime, drugs, violence, poverty, and decay. Homelessness, record high. Suicide rate, highest since the Great Depression. Every year, whopping 100,000 Americans are dying from drug overdose. And that number has grown fivefold over the last 2 decades. Some sociologists have coined a term for this unique American phenomenon, deaths of despair. On social media, there are shocking videos of American cities where drug addicts hang out on the streets like zombies. There are sprawling homeless tents in all the major cities now, something that would have been rare just 15 years ago. When it comes to health, America is a very sick nation, both physically and mentally. 75% of the population have serious weight problems. 43% are obese, and another 32% are overweight. The United States of America is also a mentally sick nation with the highest use of antidepressants and psychotropic drugs. In 2016, Americans spent $150 billion on cocaine, heroin, fentanyl, meth, etc. And 18 million Americans use the recently legalized marijuana on a daily basis. Tens of millions of people, including teens, preteens, and toddlers, believe it or not, are also on brain-altering big pharma drugs. Most of these people need to numb themselves in order to forget about their miserable lives. In summary, the average American is broke, sick, and depressed. But hey, the stock market is worth $50 trillion. America is dangerous to itself and the world. All empires come to an end. While most people in the US are living in a dangerous bubble of hubris, denial, and ignorance, the oligarchs who rule America understand history and the geopolitical zeitgeist. Ideally, they would accept the emerging multipolar world and peacefully dismantle the American empire like what the USSR did more than 30 years ago. However, the globalists seem determined to go down fighting. Their plan is to hobble everyone else so that the US will relatively stay as the most powerful nation. The primary strategy will be to disrupt Eurasia by trying to weaken or destroy Russia, Iran, and China, the three most determined challengers to the American empire. In that process, destruction of Europe will be an acceptable collateral damage. Whether it's the blowing up of Nord Stream pipelines, the devastation of the German economy, assassinations of leaders, destroying the European society through social engineering, total thought control, censorship, and tyranny, a nuclear war between Russia and Europe, all is fair in war and geopolitics. The US will also seek to cripple the euro before the dollar weakens significantly. Similarly, in Asia, the US empire will seek to fuel a devastating war against China, America's only true multidimensional rival. The US will attempt to use as many geopolitical pawns as possible: Taiwan, Japan, the Philippines, Australia, India, etc. The question is not whether the mad people in Washington, D.C. will go to sleep, but if the sane ones in Europe and Asia will wake up. The end.